She hit the ground face first in the mountain dust, her wrists still burning from the rope, and she did not make a single sound, not one cry, not one word. She just pushed herself up on shaking arms, spit the blood from her lip, and looked straight down that empty trail, like the men who left her there weren't even worth the breath it would take to curse them. If you've ever been thrown away by people who should have protected you, this story is for you. Subscribe, follow every part to the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Grace Whitaker had done everything right. That was the part nobody wanted to hear. That was the part that made no difference at the end of the day when Silas Crowder stood up in front of the Millhaven congregation and pointed his finger at her like she was something the dogs dragged in off the street. She had taught their children. She had graded their papers by lamplight, worked 6 days a week for 2 years, without complaint, given everything she had to that town, and that schoolhouse, and that community. She had kept the church donation ledger with perfect handwriting, every column balanced, every penny accounted for. And none of it mattered. Not one bit of it. Because Silas Crowder wanted her to marry him. And she had said no. The wagon had been moving since before sunrise. 2 of Crowder's hired riders sat up front, and Grace sat in the back with her wrists tied behind her, and a bruise rising along her jaw from where one of them had caught her when she tried to fight back at the jailhouse door. She hadn't cried then either. She hadn't cried at the trial, hadn't cried when the preacher looked away from her eyes. Hadn't cried when the women who'd been her neighbors for 2 years crossed to the other side of the street to avoid being seen near her. She saved it all. She held every bit of it down beneath her ribs like a banked coal. The wagon slowed somewhere along the high mountain trail, somewhere above the tree line, where the summer heat pressed down like a flat iron, and the rocks on either side of the road were the color of dried bone. The bigger rider, she never learned his name, and didn't want to climb down from the seat, and walked around to the back. He grabbed her by the arm, and she didn't give him the satisfaction of pulling away. "End of the line," he said. She looked at him. "The courthouse is still 2 days from here." He smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Courthouse ain't where you're headed, Miss Whitaker." He cut the rope on her wrists with a belt knife, and then he pushed her. Not helped her down. Pushed her. Hard enough that she went off the back of that wagon and hit the road with her hands and knees, the dust rising up around her like a small brown cloud, the sharp gravel cutting through her palms. She heard them laugh. Both of them. She heard the bigger one say, "Crowder says no man in these mountains takes in a woman marked by him. You're gonna die out here, and the only thing anyone will say about it is that you deserved it." She heard the wagon creak as they turned it around. She heard the hoofbeats go. And then there was nothing but the wind coming off the high peaks and the sound of a hawk somewhere above her, and the distant dry crackle of the summer heat itself. Grace Whitaker pushed herself up onto her knees. She looked at her bleeding palms. She looked at the empty road stretching ahead of her in both directions. Dust, settling, no sign of a roof or a well or another living soul anywhere in either direction. Then she looked down at her left sleeve. Pressed her hand flat against it. Felt the thin, hard edge of the ledger sewn into the lining. Still there. She got to her feet. Adjusted what was left of her dress, set her jaw, and she started walking. Donde? She walked for close to 3 hours before the heat started winning. It wasn't something that happened all at once. It was slow and honest, the way all real suffering is. First the headache dull and deep behind her eyes. Then the way her vision started going bright at the edges, too bright, the kind of bright that had nothing to do with the sun, and everything to do with how long it had been since she'd had water. Her mouth was completely dry. Her lips were cracking. The cut on her lip had crusted over, but every time she tried to swallow it pulled. She was not naive about what was happening to her body. She had grown up in Missouri River country, and she knew the difference between regular summer heat and the kind that killed people, and this was starting to edge toward the second kind. She kept walking. She told herself she was walking toward the courthouse. She told herself about the ledger, about the names inside it, about the forged debt notices, and the stolen deeds, and the 53 families that Silas Crowder had systematically crushed over the last 4 years. She told herself that every step forward was a step toward the moment she could lay that book open in front of someone who still believed in the law. She was on her third conversation with herself about all of this when her knee buckled. She caught herself on a pine branch, stood there breathing hard. The world was doing something strange and slow at the edges. She was still standing, but she was losing ground. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw anything. Single horse, slow, deliberate. Coming from the higher trail above the tree line, picking down through the switchback with the kind of calm that said whoever was riding it had been in these mountains long enough that nothing up here surprised them anymore. Grace straightened. She wiped the blood off her chin with the back of her hand. She squared her shoulders. She was aware of how she must look. Torn dress cut, lip road dust in her hair, bleeding palms, no horse, no bag, no water. And she made a decision in the half-second before the horse came around the bend. She would not look like prey. Whatever else she looked like, she would not look like something that could be taken advantage of again. The horse was a big dark bay with a calm eye. The man on it was tall, dark-haired, short-bearded, wearing a sun-faded work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. A rifle laid across the saddle horn in front of him, the way men carry firearms when they're not looking for trouble, but they're not surprised when it finds them. He pulled up about 15 feet away and looked at her, not at her torn dress, not at the blood, not at any of the things that would have made another man either pity her or decide she was useful. He looked at her face. He looked at her eyes. He looked at the rope burns on her wrists. And then he looked at the road behind her. The silence went on for a beat too long. "Horse go lame," he said. His voice was low and even. No dramatic concern, no false warmth, just a question. Grace held his gaze. "I don't have a horse." "You walk up from Millhaven." "I was put out of a wagon, back on the switchback." He looked again at the rope burns, then back at her face. "Crowder's men." The fact that he named Crowder without her saying a single word about any of it sent a cold line through her despite the heat. She studied him harder. "You know him. Everybody in these mountains knows Crowder." He shifted in the saddle, and it wasn't a relaxed shift. It was the kind of adjustment a man made when a situation was costing him something to stay in. "If those are his riders, they won't have gone far. They'll be watching to see where you end up." "I know. And you're still standing on the road." "I'm aware of where I'm standing." Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. Too reluctant to be that. More like acknowledgement, the smallest admission that she hadn't answered the way he expected. "Caleb Rourke," he said. "Grace Whitaker." He didn't offer to shake her hand. He didn't climb down. He just sat there on the bay horse with the rifle across the saddle, and he looked at her for another long moment with those dark eyes that gave very little away. Then he said, "If Crowder left you alive out here, it means you've still got something he wants." Grace pressed her left hand flat against her sleeve. "Yes." "And you're not going to tell me what it is?" "Not yet." That almost not a smile again. Then he swung down off the horse in a single movement, and she noticed that he kept the rifle in his left hand, when he did it not pointed at anything, just present, just part of how he moved through the world. He held out the canteen from his saddle without ceremony. She took it. She drank. She didn't gulp it down like a drowning woman, even though her body was screaming at her to. She drank 3 careful mouthfuls, lowered the canteen, and handed it back. He was watching her do it. "You're not from these mountains," he said. "No." "Missouri." She looked up. "How did you know that? Way you talk." He took the canteen, corked it, hung it back on the saddle. "And you drank like someone told you not to drink too fast when you're heat sick. Missouri River country teaches that. Mountain people just drink." Grace said nothing. She was recalibrating everything she'd decided about him in the first 30 seconds. "I've got a cattle camp about 4 miles north," Caleb said. "1 cabin, 2 ranch hands. It's not comfortable, and I'm not offering it because I'm generous." He looked out at the trail ahead. "I'm offering it because leaving a woman on this road in this heat is the kind of thing I won't be able to stop thinking about tonight, and I've got enough things already that I can't stop thinking about." It was possibly the least romantic offer of shelter Grace had ever heard in her life. She said, "I won't be in your way." "You will be," he said, "but I'll manage." He gathered the bay's reins and started walking, and Grace understood this was the invitation, not words, not a gesture, just movement, a direction. She fell into step beside him. Neither of them said anything for a long time. The cattle camp was exactly what he'd described it as. She didn't know why she had expected anything more, but there was something about arriving at a place after you'd been left for dead that made the rough edges of it hit harder. One main cabin unpainted set back from a corral with 3 horses standing in the late afternoon heat. A smokehouse, a stone ring for fire, a well that Caleb immediately told her was running low because this was the 3rd consecutive dry summer, and the creek above them was down to half. 2 ranch hands looked up from what they were doing when the 2 of them came in through the gate. The older one, wide-weathered gray-stubbled, looked at Grace and looked at Caleb and said absolutely nothing, which Grace decided was a sign of genuine intelligence. The younger one, who couldn't have been more than 19, stared at her bleeding lip and said, "What happened?" "She was put off a wagon," Caleb said. "She's staying until she can ride into town." "That's going to be at least—" "I know how long it's going to be, Pete." Caleb's tone didn't change, but it had a quality in it that stopped the sentence entirely. He looked at Grace. "There's a water bucket inside the door. Bandages in the left cabinet. You'll sleep on the bunk nearest the window. Any questions?" "No." "Good." He handed the bay's reins to Pete. "Then I'll see you at supper." He walked off toward the corral, and Grace stood in the middle of that bare dirt yard in the dying afternoon light and understood very clearly that no one here was going to make anything easy for her. She also understood with a clarity that surprised her that she didn't want anyone to. She walked into the cabin and found the water bucket and opened the left cabinet and found the bandages. She cleaned her own palms. She wrapped her own wrists. She washed the blood off her chin and looked at herself in the small piece of tin that served as a mirror on the wall above the basin, and what she saw was not a ruined woman and not a victim and not a thief. She looked like a woman who had taken a hard day and was still standing at the end of it. She could work with that. Supper was beans and salt pork and cornbread cooked in a cast-iron pan, and nobody said anything of consequence during the meal, except Pete, who asked her twice if she wanted more beans, and the older ranch hand Walt, she'd learned his name by then, who said at one point, without looking up from his plate, "You teach school." "I did," Grace said. "In Millhaven." "Yes." Walt nodded like this confirmed something. He still didn't look up. "My sister's kids went to Millhaven School 2 seasons back, said their teacher was fair." "I tried to be." "Crowder ran you out anyway." It wasn't a question. Grace looked at him. He was eating his beans with the focused patience of a man who had watched a lot of things happen in these mountains over a lot of years and had long since stopped being surprised by any of them. "Yes," she said. Walt nodded again, said nothing else. Caleb had been eating across the table from her the whole time and said nothing at all through any of it. But she caught him once watching her face when she answered Walt's questions. Not with suspicion. With something more careful than that. Something she might have called assessment if she was being generous. After supper, she helped wash the tin plates without asking whether she was supposed to. She heard Caleb come to stand in the doorway behind her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." She kept washing. "You said if I stayed I work. This is the work that's available right now." A pause, long enough that she thought he might just leave. Then he said, "There's a section of fence line on the east pasture that needs mending before morning. If those riders are watching the place, a broken fence is an invitation. Tell me where it is." Another pause. "I'll show you in the morning." He left. Grace dried her hands and sat down on the bunk by the window and pressed her palm flat against her left sleeve one more time, feeling the hard, thin edges of the ledger through the lining. 53 families, stolen deeds, forged debts, names she knew. She thought about what Caleb had said on the road. If Crowder left you alive, it means you've still got something he wants. He was right. Crowder thought she'd broken under the trial. Thought the public shame and the jail time and the threat of worse had scared the truth out of her. He hadn't been there when they loaded her into the wagon, hadn't watched her face when the riders tied her wrists. He'd sent his men to dump her in the mountains and let the heat and the isolation finish what the trial had started. He didn't know she still had the ledger. He didn't know she was alive and under the roof of a man who hadn't flinched at the sight of her rope burns. He didn't know. She lay back on the bunk and listened to the night sounds of the mountain pressing in through the window, wind in the pines, cattle moving out in the dark, the distant rhythm of thunder somewhere far to the west. She pressed her hand flat over her sleeve. She was still in the fight. The next 3 days taught Grace things she had not known she needed to learn. She learned that cattle in summer heat were stupid and stubborn and expensive. And Caleb Rourke loved them with the quiet, relentless devotion of a man who has transferred most of his feeling for people onto something that requires less explanation. She learned that Walt had been on this mountain longer than anyone, and knew where every water source was and which ones were drying up. She learned that Pete was 19 years old, genuinely good-natured, and absolutely terrified of thunderstorms, in the way that some people who've seen lightning do real damage never quite get over. She learned that Caleb was awake before her every morning, without exception, that he worked through the afternoon heat, without complaint, that he could fix almost anything with rope and a knife, and about 20 minutes of silence, and that he watched her work the way a man watched something he was trying to decide the full measure of. On the second morning, she showed up at the fence line before he did. She heard him come up behind her, heard him stop, heard the pause that meant she had done something he hadn't expected. "How did you know which section?" he said. "Walt told me last night." She turned to look at him. He was carrying fence wire and a pair of pliers, and he had a look on his face like a man who was rapidly running out of reasons to keep his distance. "You going to show me how to do this, or are we going to have a conversation about it first?" He handed her the pliers. That was the whole answer. By noon they had fixed 6 sections side by side in the dust and the summer heat, and he had corrected her technique twice without being condescending about it, and once when she pulled the wire too fast and it snapped back and cut across her thumb. He stopped what he was doing and wrapped it with a piece of clean cloth from his shirt pocket before she even asked. He did it the same way he'd handed her the canteen, without ceremony, just a thing that needed doing. She looked down at his hands wrapping her thumb, and she thought, this man has been alone up here a long time. She didn't say it. She understood instinctively that saying it would be the fastest way to make him close off everything that was quietly beginning to open. On the third day, she found the cut in the fence line that wasn't where. It was cut. Clean, deliberate, on the south corner, nearest the lower trail, the corner where cattle would drift through in the dark if nobody caught it before nightfall. She called Caleb over. He crouched down next to it and looked at it for a long moment. "That's not old," he said. "No." She crouched next to him. "Caleb." She kept her voice level. "Do you have Crowder's land notices? The ones about back taxes?" He looked at her sideways. "Why?" "Because I need to compare them against something." The silence went on for a beat. "You've got more than one kind of trouble sewn into that sleeve," he said. It wasn't a question either. She held his eyes. "Your ranch is in the ledger," she said. "He's already filed a forged debt claim against your northern acres. I saw your name in it the first night I looked. I didn't know how to tell you." Caleb was very still. "How long?" he said. His voice hadn't changed in tone, but there was something underneath it now that made the air between them feel like the moment before thunder. "The filing date on your claim was 8 months ago." He stood up. He looked out across his pasture, his cattle, the fence line that stretched north toward the high ridge, all of it. Everything he had. Everything he'd built in 10 years of solitude on this mountain. Then he turned back to her and said, "Show me the ledger." It was the first time since she'd arrived that anything between them felt like equal ground. She reached into her left sleeve and pulled out the folded ledger and handed it to him. He opened it right there at the fence line in the full summer sun and read through 3 pages without saying a single word. His jaw was set tight. His hands held the edges of the paper with the controlled steadiness of a man who was deciding something fundamental about his own life. Then he closed it carefully and handed it back to her. "That's not just your name it clears," he said. "I know. There are ranches in here that have already been sold, families already gone. I know that too." He looked at her, a long, serious look. Not the cautious measuring look of the last 3 days. Something different now. Something that acknowledged they were in this together, whether either of them had chosen it. "I've got a contact at the Territorial Land Office," he said. "Man I went to school with before he went east to study law. I've been holding his name in my back pocket for 2 years waiting to need him bad enough." "I think we need him," Grace said. "Yeah." He looked at the ledger in her hands and then at her face. "We do." He started back toward the cabin, stopped after 10 paces. Without turning around, he said, "You were going to carry that thing all the way to the courthouse by yourself." "I was going to try," she said. He nodded once, like he was filing that away. Then he kept walking. Grace looked down at the ledger in her hands, and for the first time since they'd thrown her off that wagon, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not safety. Not yet. Not anything soft or comfortable. But something that felt for the first time in a long time like the possibility of winning. She tucked the ledger back into her sleeve and went to help Walt with the cattle before the afternoon storm came in. Walt found the second-cut fence before breakfast. He came into the cabin while Grace was stirring the oatmeal and dropped a piece of wire on the table without a word. Clean cut. Same angle as the one she and Caleb had found the day before on the south corner. Same deliberate hand. Caleb looked at it. Then he looked at Walt. "South side again," he said. "East this time, near the boulder crossing." Walt poured himself coffee and sat down. "Somebody was out there last night." Pete came in through the door behind him, younger face tighter than usual. "I heard something around 2 in the morning. Thought it was deer." "Deer don't carry wire cutters," Caleb said. The silence that followed had weight to it. Grace kept stirring the oatmeal and didn't look up, but she was listening to every breath in that room. "They're not trying to steal cattle," she said. Everyone looked at her. She set down the spoon and turned around. "If they wanted your cattle, they'd cut the fence and run them out in the dark. One clean operation one night. But they're cutting in different places on different nights. Small cuts. They want you to spend your days fixing fence instead of watching the trail. They want you tired and distracted and looking in the wrong direction." Caleb was watching her with that careful look she was starting to recognize, the one that meant he was recalculating something. "They're stalling," he said. "They're waiting for something," she said. "Or someone." Walt drank his coffee. "Courthouse judge comes through Colder Creek in 10 days for the summer circuit. If Crowder's got forged papers filed, he needs that judge to sign off before anybody contests them." He looked at Caleb. 10 days is your window." 10 days. Grace looked at Caleb. He looked at her. The oatmeal was starting to stick to the bottom of the pot, and neither of them moved to fix it. "We need to get word to your contact at the land office," she said. "Nearest telegraph is in Colder Creek," Caleb said. 12 miles down the mountain." "That's Crowder's town," Walt said flatly. "I know it's his town. Every man in that telegraph office reports to him." "I know that too," Pete said. "So what do we do?" Caleb picked up the piece of cut wire and turned it over in his fingers once, then set it back down on the table. "I ride down tonight, after dark. Telegraph office operator is a man named Hicks. He owes me from 2 winters back when I pulled his son out of a snowdrift and didn't tell anyone about it. He'll send the wire quiet." Grace said, "I'm coming with you." "No." "Caleb." "Grace." His voice was level, but it had that particular quality she'd heard once before at the fence line, right before he'd shut down a sentence with 2 words. "Crowder's men are watching this place. If you ride out tonight and they see you, the ledger goes with you, and everything we've got goes with it. You stay." She wanted to argue. She understood that he was right, which made wanting to argue worse. "Then take this." She reached into her sleeve and pulled out 2 pages she'd carefully separated from the ledger the night before, the ones with Caleb's name and the names of the 3 neighboring ranches. "Give these to Hicks to send along with the wire. Your contact at the land office needs to see the actual document numbers, not just a description." Caleb looked at the pages in her hand, looked at her face. "You separated those last night," he said. "Yes. Knowing I'd need to go. Knowing someone would need to go." He took the pages, folded them once, and put them inside his shirt. Then he finished his coffee and walked out to saddle his horse. Walt watched him go. Then he looked at Grace with those old weathered eyes that had seen 30 years of mountain life. "You're trouble," he said. "I know," she said. "Good kind or bad kind, I ain't decided yet." "Neither have I," she said honestly, and turned back to fix the oatmeal before it burned entirely. Walt almost smiled. Almost. So Caleb was gone before the sun went down, and he wasn't back by midnight. Grace didn't sleep. She sat on the bunk by the window with Caleb's spare rifle across her knees. He'd left it without being asked, just laid it across the foot of the bunk before he walked out. And she listened to the mountain dark, and ran through every bad outcome she could think of. Crowder's men stopping him on the road. Hicks refusing. The telegraph wire already watched. Caleb Rourke lying in a dry creek bed somewhere between here and Colder Creek, because he'd ridden into town on behalf of a woman he'd known less than a week. She pressed her hand flat over her sleeve where the ledger sat, and told herself she was thinking clearly, that she was calculating risk like a reasonable person. She was not thinking clearly. She was scared for him in a way that had very little to do with strategy. Pete fell asleep in the chair by the door around 10 o'clock. Walt sat outside on the step all night, which Grace understood was its own kind of watch, and she was grateful for it in a way she couldn't quite put into words. Caleb came back at 2 in the morning. She heard his horse before she heard anything else, that specific cadence of the bay's walk already familiar in a way that surprised her when she noticed it. She heard him come through the gate. She heard him unsaddle in the dark. She heard the cabin door open. He came in and saw her sitting upright on the bunk with the rifle across her lap, and the lamp turned low, and he stopped inside the door for a moment. "Hicks sent it," he said. The breath she let out was longer than she meant it to be. "Any trouble?" she said. "Some." He pulled the chair out from the table and sat down, and she could see then in the low lamplight that his shirt was torn at the left shoulder, and there was a dark stain along his forearm that she was nearly certain was not mud. She was off the bunk and across the room before she finished deciding to move. "Let me see your arm." "It's nothing." "Caleb." He looked up at her. She was standing right in front of him now, and she could see his face clearly, and what she saw there was not pain exactly. It was the flat, controlled expression of a man who had been hurt, and had decided the hurt wasn't allowed to matter yet. "One of Crowder's riders was watching the road out of town," he said. "I went around him. He caught my trail on the way back. We had a conversation." "With knives?" "Briefly." She went to the left cabinet, got the bandages, came back and sat down across from him, and held out her hand, and he looked at her hand for a moment, and then he rolled up his sleeve. The cut was 6 inches long along the outside of his forearm. Not deep enough to be dangerous, but deep enough to have bled hard and to need cleaning. She worked on it in silence the way he'd wrapped her thumb in silence 3 days ago at the fence line, and she felt the exact same exchange happening in reverse, the careful, impersonal attention of one person to another person's pain, the intimacy of it that neither of them had agreed to, and both of them felt anyway. "He recognized you," she said. "He knew who I was. He didn't know about you, least he didn't let on. You think Hicks will hold? He'll hold." Caleb's voice was certain in the quiet, private way of a man who had tested a thing and knew the answer. "He's not a brave man, but he's a grateful one. There's a difference." She tied off the bandage and sat back. He rolled his sleeve down over it, without looking at the work she'd done, which she understood was its own kind of acknowledgement. "Your contact at the land office," she said. "What's his name?" "Daniel Marsh. He's with the Territorial Commissioner's office in Denver now. If he gets the wire and the page copies, he can flag Crowder's filings and hold them pending review. That buys us time to get to the circuit judge before Crowder does." 10 days, she said. 9 now. Pete snored in his chair. Walt was still outside. The lamp burned low between them and outside the window, the mountain pressed in dark and close, and full of summer heat that hadn't broken even in the middle of the night. "Why did you come back for the telegraph yourself?" Grace said. "You could have sent Walt." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Walt's got a family in Butte he sends money to every month. If Crowder's men picked him up on that road, he loses the money and they lose the man." He looked at the table. "I don't have anyone waiting on me." Grace looked at his face in the lamplight and thought about what it cost a man to say that out loud with absolutely no drama attached to it. Just fact. Just the plainest accounting of a life lived alone. She thought about her 2 years in Millhaven, teaching other people's children in a rented room with a borrowed bookshelf, waiting for a life that kept almost arriving. "Neither do I," she said. He looked at her then. Really looked at her, not measuring, not calculating, just looking, and she held it without looking away, because she was past the point of pretending she didn't know what was happening between them. She just wasn't past the point of being careful about it. "Get some sleep," he said finally. His voice had something different in it now, lower, less armored. "You too," she said. She went back to the bunk. He stayed at the table for a while longer, but she heard him eventually lie down on his side of the cabin, and somewhere in the next hour, she finally slept. The morning after Caleb's night ride, everything changed tempo. He came in from the corral before she finished making coffee, and he had that look, the tight jaw, the eyes working through something fast. He dropped 2 things on the table. One was a mud-caked bill of notice. The other was a rider's badge, the tin kind that Crowder's hired men wore. "Found it by the water trough," he said. "Somebody wanted me to find it." Grace picked up the notice. Her chest went cold. It was a formal demand for back taxes on Caleb's northern 40 acres, signed with the territorial seal, except the seal was wrong. She'd seen enough of Crowder's forgeries to recognize the slightly uneven press, the ink color, that was just half a shade darker than authentic government issue. "This isn't real," she said. "I know it isn't real." His voice was flat and hard. "But if I don't respond to it within 5 days under territorial law, the property goes to lien and sale. Real or not, the process runs whether the document is honest." 5 days, Grace said. "We have 9 to the circuit judge. 4 days of overlap. If Marsh gets the wire and moves fast, maybe he flags the filing before the lien processes." He sat down. He looked like a man running numbers that weren't adding up the way he needed them to. "Maybe." "Maybe isn't enough," Grace said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She sat down across from him. Spread the ledger open on the table between them, the actual ledger, now not the copied pages. She turned to the section with Caleb's ranch and laid her finger on the entry. "This is how he does it," she said. "He files first in the territorial office under a false agent name. Then he sends the notice. Then before the owner can respond or contest, he has a buyer already lined up. Look here, there's a sale date written in pencil in the margin 3 days after the notice date. He's already got a buyer for your North 40. Caleb stared at the penciled date. She watched something move through his expression. Not panic, something older and quieter and more dangerous than panic. The feeling of a man watching something he built get dismantled by someone who was never going to show their face. "Who's the buyer?" he said. She turned 1 page. "A land holding company in Denver. Registered name is Clearwater Territorial Holdings." She paused. "Caleb, look at the agent name on the registration." He leaned forward. "Read it." Looked up at her. "That's the county assessor," he said. "Yes. He's been in that office for 11 years, and he's been on Crowder's payroll for at least 4 of them." She turned 2 more pages and showed him 3 other entries. 3 other ranches, 3 other forged notices, all with the same assessor's name, all completed, all gone. He's not just a land broker, he's got the county government working for him. That's why nobody could fight him. They didn't know who they were actually fighting. Walt had come in at some point during this, and was standing at the edge of the table reading over Caleb's shoulder. He straightened up slowly. "That's why Henderson sold," Walt said low. "And Briggs. I never believed Henderson would sell voluntarily. Man loved that land like his own blood." "He didn't sell voluntarily," Grace said. "He was processed out. There's a difference." The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. Then Pete appeared in the doorway. His face was pale. "There's a rider on the South Ridge," he said, "just sitting there, not moving." Nobody moved for exactly 2 seconds. Then Caleb said, "Walt, stay with her." He was already up and reaching for the rifle. Grace caught his arm. He stopped and looked at her hand on his arm and then at her face. "Don't go out there alone," she said. "It's my land." "That's exactly why you shouldn't go out there alone. They want you reactive. They want you to ride out angry and give them a reason." She held his eyes. "Think about what they want. Then do the other thing." The muscle in his jaw worked. She could feel the tension in his arm under her hand, the absolute genuine desire of a man to ride straight at the thing threatening him, which was a good instinct in a fight and a terrible one in a legal war. Slowly, he lowered the rifle. "What's the other thing?" he said. "We write a response to that notice. Today, with the ledger entries attached as evidence. We send it to Daniel Marsh's office and to the Territorial Courthouse by the fastest route available." "That's still Colder Creek." "No." She turned to Walt. "You said there was a postal rider who came through the North Trail every Thursday. Is today Thursday?" Walt said, and there was something in his voice that sounded like the first cautious edge of hope. "Comes through about 3 hours from now." "Can he carry a legal packet to the Territorial Court?" For $2, that man would carry a legal packet to the moon. Grace was already pulling paper from the stack near the window. "Then we have 3 hours." She looked at Caleb. "Sit down. Tell me every piece of this property you've held every year, every tax payment. I'm going to write a response that gives Marsh and the circuit judge no choice but to look at this file." Caleb looked at her standing there with paper in her hand and the ledger open between them and the full force of what she was doing, written clearly across her face. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down and said, 1873. Purchased outright from the Territorial Land Office, no mortgage. First tax payment made September of that year. She started writing. They worked straight through the morning. Caleb talked, and Grace wrote, and Walt brought coffee twice, and Pete kept watch at the window with one eye on the South Ridge, where the rider had eventually disappeared, which was almost worse than when he was visible. The document Grace constructed was 4 pages long, precise and devastating. She cited the ledger entries by page and line number. She quoted territorial property law from memory. 2 years of reading everything in the Millhaven Lending Library had put a shocking amount of law in her head, most of it useless until now. She cross-referenced the forged seal against the real seal specifications from the Territorial Code. She listed the assessor's name 4 times in 4 separate contexts, each one worse than the last. When she finished, she handed it to Caleb. He read every word. She watched him read it, watched his expression move through the argument she had built sentence by sentence, and when he got to the last page, he set it down and looked at her across the table. "Where did you learn to do this?" he said. "I didn't," she said honestly. "I learned to think like this. I've been building this argument in my head since the night they arrested me." He looked at the document again. "This is better than anything a paid lawyer in this territory would have written." "It should be. I've been the person this argument needed to exist for longer than any paid lawyer has." Walt came in from outside. "Postal riders coming up the North Trail. Saw his dust." Caleb stood. He folded the document carefully and tucked it inside an oilskin wrap he pulled from the cabinet shelf. Then he looked at Grace. "If this works." "When it works," she said. Something moved through his expression. quick and quiet, and almost gone before she could name it. "When it works," he said, "there are 52 other families who need to know what's in that ledger." "I know. Some of them are already gone, scattered. You won't be able to reach all of them. I'll reach as many as I can." He picked up the oilskin packet and turned to go meet the postal rider. Stopped at the door. "Grace." He said her name like it cost him something, not much. Not yet, but something. "If Marsh gets this and moves on, Crowder is going to know within 48 hours that the ledger is real and that you're not dead in the mountains like he planned." "I know that too." "He'll come here." "I know." Caleb looked at her for a long, straight moment. Then he said, "Good. I'll be ready for him." He walked out. Grace listened to his boots on the dirt, the sound of him greeting the postal rider, the low exchange of voices. She looked down at the open ledger on the table. All those names. All those families. All those penciled sale dates 3 days after official notices. The whole machinery of theft laid out in ink and column lines so orderly it was almost beautiful in a terrible way. She thought about Henderson, who had loved his land like his own blood. She thought about Caleb riding alone in the dark last night and coming back with a knife cut on his arm and saying, "I don't have anyone waiting on me," with no self-pity in it at all. Just the plain fact of a solitary life offered up as a reason for a risk. She closed the ledger and tucked it back into her sleeve. Outside, she heard the postal rider leave, heard Caleb's footsteps coming back. When he walked in, she was already at the stove starting on dinner, and he stopped just inside the door, the same way he had the first night she'd done something domestic in his cabin without being asked. Like it meant something he hadn't worked out yet how to account for. $2, he said. Ryder took it. Good. He moved to the table. Sat. She could feel him watching her at the stove, but it wasn't the measuring watch of the first days anymore. It was something more settled and more restless at the same time. "You've been in my camp less than a week," he said. 5 days, she said. "In 5 days you've identified a criminal conspiracy against 11 mountain ranches, drafted a legal document, and scared off one of Crowder's riders with a warning shot I still haven't asked you about." Grace kept her eyes on the stove. "You heard about that. Walt told me this morning. He was in the cabin going for the ledger. I made a decision. I left you a rifle and told you to stay behind, and you ran through smoke toward the man who was after you." She turned around then. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not disapproval, not admiration exactly, something more complicated than either. "You also went into the smoke," she said. "It's my ranch. The ledger is my fight." They looked at each other across the room, and the air between them had a quality she recognized. Now the same quality it had at the fence line, when he'd wrapped her thumb, the same quality it had in the lamplight 2 in the morning, when they'd both admitted there was nobody waiting on them. The quality of 2 people standing at the edge of something neither of them had planned. "You should have stayed behind," he said, but his voice had no real force in it. "You should have taken Walt with you to Colder Creek," she said. "We can keep going, or we can accept that neither of us is especially good at the thing we're supposed to do." His jaw worked. Then slowly something gave way in his expression. Not completely, not all at once. Just a crack in the stone, the smallest opening. "I accept it," he said. She turned back to the stove. The corner of her mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile, but was close enough. "Dinner in an hour," she said. Outside, the summer sky was going the color of iron to the west. Not a storm yet, something building toward one. Walt came in, sat down without ceremony, looked at the 2 of them, and said nothing whatsoever, which was the most eloquent thing he'd done all week. Pete came in right behind him. "Ryder's back on the South Ridge. Different rider, same position." Caleb looked at Grace. She looked at him. The almost smile was gone. They both understood, without saying it, that the next move was Crowder's, and that it was coming before the ridge went dark. Caleb reached under the table and checked his sidearm. Grace pressed her hand flat over her sleeve. 9 days to the circuit judge. 2 days since the wire went out. Somewhere between here and Denver, Daniel Marsh was either reading their wire right now or he wasn't, and there was absolutely nothing left they could do about it except hold this ground and wait for whoever came down off that ridge after dark. Hold the ground. That was all. Walt poured coffee for everyone without being asked. Pete sat down and started cleaning his rifle with the quiet, careful focus of a 19-year-old who had decided sometime in the last 5 days that he was going to act like a man if it came to that. Grace picked up her spoon and stirred the pot. Caleb watched the window. The iron sky moved west, and the mountain held its breath. The rider on the south ridge didn't come down that night. He didn't come the next morning either. That was worse. Caleb had stayed at the window past midnight, and Grace had fallen asleep sitting up on the bunk with the rifle across her knees, and when she woke just before dawn, he was still there. Same chair, same angle. The coffee in his cup, long cold. She didn't say anything about it. She just got up and made fresh coffee and put a cup in front of him, and he drank it without taking his eyes off the window. Still there, she said. Left around 3. Different man came back an hour later. They're rotating. 2-man watch at least. He finally looked away from the window. He looked tired in the way that had nothing to do with sleep, the kind of tired that came from holding tension in your body for too many hours without releasing it. They're waiting on something. An order. Permission. Crowder doesn't move until he's certain, Grace said. She sat down across from him. That's how he's operated for 4 years. He doesn't show his hand until the other person has nothing left to play. He thinks you have nothing left. He did. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The postal rider left yesterday. If Marsh got the wire and moved within 24 hours, Crowder might already know something went wrong, or he might not know yet. We're in the window between those two things. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Which one is more dangerous? If he doesn't know, yet we have time. She looked at the window. If he already knows, he'll stop waiting for permission. They both looked at the window. Walt came in from outside, and the look on his face was the specific look of a man delivering bad news he'd been hoping wouldn't be his to deliver. South Trail, he said. 4 riders. Not watching anymore. They came in the middle of the morning when the summer heat was already pressing hard, and the light was flat and white and honest. 4 of them riding slow and deliberate, the way men rode when they wanted you to see them coming and spend the time between seeing and arriving getting scared. Caleb walked out to the middle of the yard alone. Grace stood in the cabin doorway with the rifle. Walt was at the corner of the smokehouse with his. Pete was on the corral fence, young face pale, but hands steady. The lead rider pulled up 15 feet out and looked at the arrangement with the mild professional interest of a man running a familiar kind of operation. Rourke, he said, not a greeting, just confirmation. You're on my land, Caleb said. His voice was the same voice he always used, level, no heat in it, which somehow made it more dangerous than shouting would have been. Mr. Crowder sends his regards. The rider shifted in the saddle. He also sends a notice of immediate lien assessment on your North 40 per the outstanding tax delinquency filed with the Territorial Assessor's Office. You've had 5 days to respond, and no response has been recorded. Response was posted yesterday, Caleb said. Territorial Courthouse and Land Commissioner's Office both. Something moved through the rider's expression. Quick and controlled, but Grace caught it. He hadn't known about the posting. That meant Crowder hadn't known either. That meant the window was still open. Be that as it may, the rider said, and his voice had shifted slightly. A fraction faster, a fraction less bored. Mr. Crowder's buyer has a legitimate claim filed and recorded as of this morning, and Mr. Crowder requests that you vacate the North 40 by end of week to allow survey. No, Caleb said. The yard went very quiet. Beg pardon? The rider said. I said no. Caleb didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for the sidearm at his hip. You come back on my land again before a territorial judge has reviewed that filing, I'll have you arrested for trespass. All 4 of you. The rider looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked past him at the cabin doorway, where Grace was standing with the rifle in plain sight. His eyes stayed on her for 2 seconds too long. "That her," he said. Low. Not really to Caleb. More like something he was filing away. Caleb stepped slightly to the left, just enough to block the rider's sightline to Grace. It was a small movement. It was also the clearest possible statement. "You're done here," Caleb said. The rider looked at him. Then he turned his horse around, and the other 3 turned with him, and they rode back up the south trail at the same deliberate pace they'd come down. Not hurrying, making sure every person in that yard understood they'd be back. Grace lowered the rifle. Her hands were shaking, and she was furious at herself for it. Not from fear from the particular physical exhaustion of holding herself completely still while her whole body wanted to do something. Caleb came back to the yard. He looked at her hands, then at her face. "You all right?" he said. "Fine." She wasn't entirely fine. He recognized me. "Yes." "Which means Crowder knows by tonight that I'm here and alive, and that the ledger is probably with me." "Yes." Which means we've got maybe until tomorrow morning before this gets significantly worse." He said it the same way he said everything level plain, no performance attached to it. Just the fact laid out flat so they could both look at it clearly. Walt came around from the smokehouse. "How bad are we talking?" "Bad enough," Caleb said. He looked out at the south trail. "Pete ride the fence line on the east side, full perimeter. I want to know if they cut anything else last night." He looked at Grace. "Come inside." Inside, Caleb spread his land survey map on the table, and Grace leaned over it next to him, and they stood close enough that she could feel the heat coming off his arm. Close enough that she was aware of it, close enough that neither of them moved away. "North 40, he said, pointing. "This is what they want first. It runs along the main water source for the upper pasture. You take this section, the rest of the ranch is unworkable inside 2 dry summers." "Choking you out," Grace said, slow but certain. He moved his finger south. "He'll file on this section next, then this one. 3 filings, 3 lien sales, legitimate or not, and the court system is so backlogged it'll take 2 years to contest even with the best evidence in the territory. Unless we get to the circuit judge first." 7 days. 7 days, she agreed. She looked at the map, and then she looked at the ledger. Then she looked at Caleb. "I need to ask you something," she said. He looked at her. "How many of these ranchers do you know personally? The ones in the ledger?" He thought for a moment. "Most of them at least by name. Some of them Henderson the Briggs family, old Tom Calloway on the North Ridge. Those are men I've worked fence line with shared water rights with. Known for years." "Are any of them still on their land?" "Calloway might be. He's stubborn enough." He paused. "Why?" "Because if we can get 3 or 4 ranchers to appear before the circuit judge with us presenting copies of their own ledger entries alongside our response filing, it stops being one woman's word against Crowder's money." She looked at him steadily. "It becomes a pattern of fraud against the mountain community. That's a different kind of case entirely." He was very still. "You want to ride out and contact them," he said. "I want to send word. Carefully. Through people Crowder's men aren't watching." She glanced toward the window where the south trail was currently empty. "You know these mountains better than anyone. You know which trails aren't watched and which neighbors can be trusted and which ones Crowder already owns." She paused. "Walt knows things too. Things he hasn't said yet." Caleb turned his head toward the door. Walt. Walt appeared in the doorway like he'd been standing just outside it, which he probably had. "Already thinking it," he said. "Calloway's grandson comes down to trade every Tuesday. That's 4 days. I can get a letter to him." "What about the Briggs family?" Grace said. Walt's face shifted. "Briggs lost their place last winter. They're in Colder Creek now working at the mill. But—" He paused, and the pause had weight. "Martin Briggs is a proud man who knows he was cheated. Proud, angry men are either very useful or very dangerous." "Which do you think he'd be?" Grace said. Walt looked at her. With the right letter useful. Grace said, "Then we write 2 letters today." Caleb put both hands flat on the map and looked at it for a long moment. She could read the tension in his shoulders, the careful working through of a man who had spent 10 years protecting this land by keeping himself to himself, by staying small and quiet and off the radar of men like Crowder, and who was now being asked to do the exact opposite of all of that. She didn't push. She understood what it cost. Then he straightened up. "Write the letters," he said. "Walt knows where to send them." They had the letters written and in Walt's hands before noon. What happened 2 hours later, none of them planned for. Pete came back from the fence perimeter at a dead run, his horse blowing hard, and he was off the saddle before it fully stopped. "Caleb," his voice was tight. "There's smoke on the ridge above the north pasture." Caleb was out the door before Pete finished the sentence. Grace was 1 step behind him. The smoke was real, and it was moving fast. Not a campfire, not an accident. The kind of broad orange-brown smoke that came from dry summer grass caught on the windward side of a slope where it would run straight down toward the cattle, and there was nothing between the fire line and the upper pasture but 300 yards of bone-dry ground. "They fired the grass," Caleb said. His voice was the flattest she'd ever heard it. "They waited for the wind to shift east, and they fired the grass." Grace understood immediately. It was exactly what the outline in the ledger described for the Callaway Ranch 3 years back. Start a fire. Cattle panic, scatter, some die. A mountain ranch without its cattle is a mountain ranch without its livelihood. Without cattle, Caleb couldn't pay his operating costs. Without operating costs covered, the forged back tax debt became real pressure. Real pressure became a forced sale. Crowder didn't just steal land, he burned people out of it. "The herd," Caleb said. He was already moving toward the corral. "Wait." Grace grabbed his arm. He turned. His eyes were hard and hot, and she could feel the energy in his arm like a wire pulled too tight. "Caleb, listen to me. This is what they want. They want you riding into that smoke. They want you separated from this yard. They want, if I lose those cattle, if you ride into that smoke alone and something happens to you, you lose everything. The cattle, the land, the case, all of it." She held his eyes. "Send Pete and Walt to cut the herd loose from the upper gate. They can drive them down the east trail away from the fire. You don't have to go into the smoke for that." He was looking at her with that taut, barely controlled expression, and she pressed forward because she could see him listening even through the fury. "And while they're doing that," she said, "you watch the cabin." His expression changed. "The ledger. If the fire is the distraction, the cabin is the target." They looked at each other for 2 hard seconds. Then Caleb turned to Pete. "East gate. Take Walt. Cut the upper herd loose and drive them down the creek trail. Don't go above the tree line under any circumstances, you hear me?" Pete was already nodding. "Yes, sir." "Walt." "Already heard," Walt said. He was pulling on his riding gloves. "Go watch your cabin." They were gone in 90 seconds. Grace and Caleb turned back to the yard, and Caleb moved to the cabin door and took up a position where he could see both the south trail and the east fence, the rifle easy in his hands. Grace stood beside him. The smoke was thickening on the ridge. She could smell it now, that specific dry pine and grass smell that meant the fire was real and moving. Somewhere up in the pasture she could hear cattle starting to call out that particular distressed lowing that meant the animals could smell it too. She pressed her hand flat against her sleeve. Caleb said very quietly, "I grew up in Kentucky, moved west when I was 22, built this place from nothing. 10 years. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the south trail, watching for movement, but he was talking, and she understood that he was talking because the alternative was letting what he was feeling eat through his chest from the inside. "First 2 winters I nearly starved," he said. "Lost half the original herd to a mountain lion in year 3. Year 5 a flood took out the south pasture, and I spent 6 weeks rebuilding the fence by hand." He paused. "I've never once thought about leaving." "You're not leaving now," Grace said. "No." His jaw was set hard. "I'm not." A sound from the east side of the yard. Both of them turned. A rider came through the east gate at a walk. Single man. No badge visible, but the way he sat, the horse had that same professional quality as the morning's lead rider. He looked at them both, and his eyes went directly to Grace, with the specific attention of a man who'd been told exactly who to look for. "Well now," he said pleasantly. "Miss Whitaker, Mr. Crowder will be very glad to hear you're looking well." Caleb raised the rifle in one smooth motion. "Off my property." "I'm just carrying a message," the rider said, not moving, not reaching for anything, hands deliberately visible. "Mr. Crowder says the fire stops when Miss Whitaker returns the personal property she took from his office." The ledger. Grace felt cold run straight through her despite the smoke-thickened heat. "That's not his property," she said. "He says different." The rider was watching her with that calm, professional patience. "He also says the forged tax notice, his word not mine, on your North 40 gets withdrawn. Your land stays your land, Mr. Rourke. All you have to do is give him back what's his." Caleb's rifle hadn't moved. "Last time." "That ledger goes to a judge," Grace said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. "That ledger goes to every family whose name is in it. You tell Crowder that." The rider looked at her for a long moment. "He was afraid you'd say that." He tilted his head toward the ridge. "Fire's moving faster now. Wind shifted again." He turned his horse and walked it back out the east gate like a man with no urgency at all, which was the most frightening possible way to leave. Caleb kept the rifle up until he was out of sight. Then he said, "They'll come in force tonight." "Yes," Grace said. "Do you want to run?" She turned and looked at him directly. "Do you—" His eyes were very dark and very certain. "No, neither do I." He lowered the rifle. Something settled in his expression, not peace, nothing as soft as that. Something more like the moment a decision stops being a decision and becomes simply the ground you're standing on. "Then we hold," he said. Pete and Walt got the cattle down the east trail by mid-afternoon. They lost 3 head to the smoke and panic, but the main herd was safe, pushed down to the lower creek pasture, where the green was still thick enough to slow any fire that tried to follow. The fire on the ridge burned itself out by evening against a natural rock break that Caleb knew was there, and Crowder's men apparently didn't. It left a black scar above the north pasture and the smell of char hanging in the air, but the pasture itself was untouched. Small victory. Grace recognized it as such and didn't make more of it than it was. What she couldn't stop thinking about was the rider's message. Crowder knew she was here. He knew the ledger was here. And he had offered Caleb's land back as a trade, which meant he was more afraid of that ledger reaching a judge than he was of anything else she might do. That fear was information. She was sitting at the table with the ledger open when Caleb came in from checking the herd count. He sat down across from her, smelling of smoke and sweat and horse, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her more and more these last 2 days, like she was a problem he'd stopped trying to solve and started just accepting. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking about what Crowder offered," she said. "He offered you your land for the ledger." "He offered me my land for your surrender," Caleb said flatly. "There's a difference." She looked at him. "You could have taken that deal. I could have shot you on the road when I first found you and saved myself a considerable amount of trouble," he said. "That was a choice too." The directness of it caught her somewhere in the chest. She looked back at the ledger. "He's scared," she said. "Scared men are dangerous." "Yes, but scared men also make mistakes." She turned to a page near the back of the ledger, one she'd been saving, one she hadn't shown him yet because the timing had never been right and she'd wanted to be certain. "Caleb, look at this entry." He leaned over. She watched him read it, watched his expression change. "That's the circuit judge's name," he said slowly. "Yes." "That's a payment. 3 payments. Over 2 years." She kept her voice neutral. "The circuit judge who comes through Colder Creek in 7 days has been on Crowder's payroll." The silence was absolute. Then Caleb said very quietly, "If the judge is bought, then the circuit court isn't where we take this." She closed the ledger. "We take it to the territorial commissioner directly. Daniel Marsh's office. That's Denver." "It's Denver," she said. 4 days hard riding. 3 days if we push." They looked at each other. "That changes everything," he said. "It changes the route," she said. "Not the destination." She held his eyes. "The evidence is still the evidence. The ledger is still the ledger. It's still 53 families and a county assessor and a bought judge and a man who has been stealing mountain land for 4 years." She paused. "It just means we have to go further to find someone who hasn't been bought." Caleb sat back. He ran a hand over his jaw, over that short beard, the gesture of a man working through the full weight of something. "Tonight," he said finally. "They come tonight, we deal with it. Tomorrow morning, if we're still standing, we ride for Denver." "Together," she said. He looked at her. "You didn't think I was sending you alone." She hadn't actually, but hearing him say it still did something to her equilibrium. "Walt and Pete stay with the ranch," he said. "2 of us travel faster, attract less attention." He looked at the ledger. "Can you ride hard for 3 days?" "I rode fence line in 100-degree heat for a week," she said. "I think I can manage 3 days." That not quite smile. She was starting to wait for it. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll take first watch." She started to stand and then stopped. "Caleb." She waited until he looked at her. The judge being in the ledger, that's not a weakness in the case. That's the center of it. A corrupt judge is the reason nobody could fight him. It explains everything. He held her eyes for a long moment. "I know. When we walk into Marsh's office with that entry, I know Grace." She heard something in the way he said her name. Something that had been building all week in the careful distance between them in early morning coffee and fence line work and lamplight conversations, and the particular honesty that came from 2 people who had decided to trust each other out of necessity, and found something growing in the space where necessity ended. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. She lay down on the bunk. Outside, the smell of smoke was still on the air, and somewhere down on the South Trail, there were men who would be back before morning. She pressed her hand flat against her sleeve and felt the ledger there, hard and real, and full of the kind of truth that powerful men spent fortunes trying to bury. Sleep didn't come easy, but it came. And when it did, her last clear thought was not about Crowder or the judge or Denver or any of the 1,000 things that could go wrong in the next 24 hours. It was about a man sitting by a window in the dark, keeping watch over something he'd decided was worth protecting. She wasn't sure exactly when that man had stopped being just her best available option and started being something she was genuinely afraid to lose. She pressed the thought down the way she pressed everything down. Careful, deliberate, stored for later. Later was coming. But first the night had to be survived. Outside, Caleb's chair scraped once against the floor as he shifted his weight, and the sound of it was against all reason the most comforting thing she'd heard in weeks. She closed her eyes. The mountain held its breath. They came at 3 in the morning. Not 4 riders this time, 6. And they didn't come down the South Trail where everyone was watching. They split, 2 from the south, 2 from the east, 2 coming around the back of the corral from the tree line. Quiet and patient, the way men moved when they'd been paid enough to take their time. Caleb heard them first. He didn't wake Grace by shaking her. He put one hand on her shoulder, one firm press, and she was sitting up with the rifle before her eyes were fully open. That was the thing about a week of sleeping in a camp where danger was real. Your body learned the language of urgency faster than your mind did. "How many?" she whispered. 6 at least, maybe more on the ridge. He moved to the window. "They're not here to talk." Walt was already up. Pete too. The 4 of them in that cabin, and the night pressing in from 3 sides, and the specific quality of silence that wasn't silence at all. It was the sound of men trying not to make sound, which was its own kind of loud to anyone listening hard enough. "What do they want?" Pete said, and his voice was steady but thin. "Same thing they always want. Walt said. He checked his rifle. For us to be someplace else. Caleb turned from his window. He looked at Grace with an expression that was completely stripped of everything soft. No almost smile, no careful distance, no measured words. Just the plain hard face of a man making a fast decision about what he valued most. The ledger goes out the back, he said. Now, with you. I'm not running. Grace. He said it the way you said a thing when there was no room left for argument. If they get in here, and they get that ledger, every family in it loses everything. You know that. He held her eyes. I'm not asking you to run. I'm asking you to protect the one thing that can't be replaced. She hated that he was right. She hated it the way you hated things that cost you something important. Where, she said. There's a dry creek bed 30 yards behind the corral. Follow it north for a quarter mile, and there's a split rock I used to use as a supply cache. Big enough to hide in. You'll hear everything from there, and I'll come for you when it's clear. And if you don't come... He looked at her straight. Then you ride to Denver alone. You know the route now. You've got the ledger. You finish it. The simplicity of it was almost unbearable. He had just handed her the plan for a version of the night where he didn't survive it, and he'd said it with the same level voice he used for everything, because falling apart in front of her was not something Caleb Rourke was apparently capable of doing. She took the ledger from her sleeve and pressed it flat against her chest for 1 second. Not dramatically. Just checking. Just making sure it was real, and then she tucked it back. She looked at him. Don't get shot. Working on it, he said. She went out the back. The creek bed was dry and smelled of dust and old pine resin, and she moved through it fast and low, not running the careful, controlled movement of someone who understood that speed and sound were two different things, and you could have one without the other if you were disciplined about it. She found the split rock. She pressed herself into the gap between the two halves of it, rifle across her knees, and she listened. For 43 of the longest minutes of her life, she listened to the sounds of Caleb's ranch under assault. Voices she didn't recognize. Caleb's voice once sharp and commanding. A crash that might have been the corral gate. Walt saying something short and profane. Horses moving the specific anxious scramble of animals that could smell human aggression. A single shot that made her hands go cold on the rifle stock, and then silence, and then Caleb's voice again, and she made herself stay in the split rock, because she had made a promise, and the ledger against her ribs was not hers alone anymore. Then another shot. Then nothing. The nothing was worse than anything. She was 10 seconds from breaking and going back when she heard footsteps in the creek bed. She raised the rifle. Pete came around the boulder with his hands half raised when he saw the rifle pointed at his face, and he said, "It's me. It's Pete. Don't shoot me, please." She lowered it. What happened? They're gone. He was breathing hard dust in his hair, a cut across his cheekbone she didn't ask about yet. Caleb ran them off. 2 of them got as far as the cabin, and Walt got one of them with the rifle, and the other one left when he realized nobody in that yard was planning to make it easy. He stopped, hands on his knees. Nobody's dead. Ours, I mean. One of theirs is going to have a bad week, but he rode out. She was already moving past him back toward the cabin. Grace, Pete called after her. She didn't stop. Caleb was sitting on the step outside the cabin door when she came through the gate. His shirt was torn at the collar, and there was blood on his left hand, not the same arm as the knife cut from Colder Creek, the other one, and he was looking at the blood with the detached expression of a man cataloging damage. She walked straight up to him and crouched down to look at the hand, and he let her take it without argument, which told her something about the state of him. Through the skin, he said. Caught the gatepost wrong in the dark. I heard 2 shots, she said. Warning shot first. Second one was Walt, and it was necessary. She looked at his hand in the gray pre-dawn light. Knuckles split, palm lacerated from something with an edge. She went inside, got the bandages, came back out, and sat on the step beside him and started cleaning it. He sat still and let her work. You stayed in the rock, he said. I said I would. You almost didn't. She glanced up at him. He was watching her hands on his, and his expression had that quality again, the one she still didn't have a full name for, the one that lived somewhere between honest and unguarded. No, she admitted. I almost didn't. Walt came around from the corral. He looked at the two of them on the step, and he looked at the bandaging, and he said, "They'll report back to Crowder before sunrise. He'll know the direct approach didn't work. We've got maybe 4 hours before he thinks of something worse." "We're riding at first light," Caleb said. Walt nodded. "I'll have the horses ready." Grace tied off the bandage. She didn't let go of his hand right away. She wasn't entirely sure she'd made a conscious decision about that. She just was still holding it, and he was still letting her, and Walt had already walked away with the profound discretion of a man who had learned 30 years ago that some things worked better when nobody commented on them. "We're going to make it to Denver," Grace said. It came out like a statement. It was partly a statement. It was partly the thing she was saying out loud, so the version of it that lived in her chest, as fear couldn't take up any more room. Caleb turned his hand over in hers, not holding on, just turning it the way you tested something you weren't sure about yet. "Yeah," he said. "We are." They left before the sun was fully up, 2 horses, 2 bedrolls, the ledger in Grace's sleeve, and enough supplies for 4 hard days, because Caleb packed for 5 days' worth and called it 4, which was the kind of practical optimism she had come to understand was simply how he moved through the world. Pete stood at the gate. He looked younger than 19 in that early light, and older than it at the same time. "You'll be all right," Grace said. "Walt's here," Pete said. Like that answered everything, which she supposed it did. Walt had pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand before she mounted. She'd looked at him. "Names," he said. "People in Denver who knew my father. Good people. You need somewhere to go if the commissioner's office is a dead end. You find one of those names." She had looked at the paper, then at Walt. "Thank you." He had shrugged with the particular economy of a man who didn't traffic in sentiment. "That ledger gets those families back what's theirs," he said. "That's all the thanks I need." She'd folded the paper and put it with the ledger. Now she and Caleb were 2 hours out of the ranch on the North Trail, moving fast, and the mountain was wide open around them. Summer blue sky heat already building the particular kind of silence that wasn't threat, just space. They didn't talk much the first hour. There was a rhythm to it, the 2 horses, the trail, the way they naturally moved at the same pace without negotiating it, that Grace noticed and didn't remark on. Then Caleb said out of nowhere, "Tell me how you found it." "Found what?" "The ledger. You were the church fund bookkeeper. How does a schoolteacher end up with a land broker's private ledger?" She'd been waiting for him to ask that properly. He'd worked with the contents of it for days without asking where it came from, because Caleb Rourke was the kind of man who operated on what was in front of him and trusted the explanation to come when it was needed. "Crowder proposed to me in February," she said. "I thought he was a respectable businessman. I said I needed time to think. He took that as encouragement." She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. "He started coming by the school, bringing things, acting like we had an arrangement we didn't have." She paused. "In March, I told him clearly that my answer was no." "And that was the beginning of it," Caleb said. "That was the beginning of it. Within 2 weeks, I noticed discrepancies in the church fund records that I was responsible for. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. All backdated, all entered in a hand that was close to mine, but not quite mine." She felt the old cold anger moving through her chest, the kind that had been keeping her walking for weeks. "He was building a case, creating a paper trail that pointed at me." "He was moving slow," Caleb said, "giving you time to change your answer." "Yes, I understood that eventually. He never said it directly. He never had to." She looked at the sky. "I started watching him instead of the other way around. I started asking questions about land records carefully through the public files, and one of the families that had lost a ranch, the wife was a former student of mine. She trusted me. She showed me paperwork she didn't understand." Her hand went involuntarily to her sleeve. "I understood it." "And you went looking for more. I went looking for the source. Crowder kept a private ledger in his office safe. I'd seen him put things in it when I'd been in his office. She stopped. You broke into his safe, Caleb said. There was no judgment in it. Almost something like approval. I had a student once who was very gifted with mechanical things, she said carefully. He taught me several things in return for extra Latin lessons. She felt the corner of her mouth move. I took only what I needed. I left everything else exactly as it was. And then he had you arrested. 3 days later. He must have checked the safe. She looked at her hands on the reins. I'd already made copies of the most critical pages and hidden them separately. The originals I sewed into my sleeve lining the night before the trial. You knew the verdict before it happened, he said. I knew Crowder had already decided what the verdict would be, she said. That's not the same thing as knowing, but it's close enough that you plan for it. He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved. The trail wound higher. You walked into that courtroom with the ledger already on you, he said. I walked into that courtroom ready to walk out of it no matter what the verdict was, she said, even if I had to do it in the back of a wagon with my hands tied. He looked at her. She felt it without turning her head. Most people would have used the copies to bargain, he said. Offered Crowder a trade, their silence for their freedom. I know. Why didn't you? She turned and looked at him directly. Because Henderson loved that land like his own blood, she said. And the Briggs family had 4 children. And there are 51 other families in that ledger who didn't have a copy of anything and didn't know what had been done to them. She held his eyes. I wasn't the only one who needed that book to see a judge. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked back at the trail. Something had shifted in his expression. Something permanent, she thought. Something that wasn't going to shift back. They rode on. They made camp the first night in a protected hollow. Caleb knew off the main trail, well hidden, and they ate dried beef and cornbread that Walt had packed, and they sat close enough to the small fire that she could see his face clearly. He hadn't said much in the last 2 hours of riding. She recognized the particular quality of his silence by now. It wasn't absence, it was thinking. The kind of thinking he didn't do out loud. What is it? She said. He looked at the fire. Daniel Marsh, he said. I've been thinking about him all day. You trust him? I trusted who he was 10 years ago. I haven't seen the man in 8 years. He turned a stick in the fire. People change. Money changes people. Power changes people. I've been building this whole ride on a wire I sent to a memory. The honesty of it landed hard. Because he was right. The wire, the document, the entire Denver plan. It all ran through one man neither of them had spoken to in years. Tell me who he was, Grace said. 10 years ago. He thought for a moment. Second son of a Kentucky family. Not much money, not much land. Worked his way through school on a scholarship from a mining company. He used to say that irony kept him warm at night. A mining scholarship for a man who was going to spend his life fighting land fraud. He paused. He helped a family I knew when I first came west, a widow with 3 boys. Crowder, not Silas his father, same operation, different face, had filed against her claim. Marsh was a young clerk then. He pulled the original filing, found a procedural error, got the claim dismissed. He was quiet. He didn't get paid for it. He just did it because it was right. Grace looked at him. That's the man you sent the wire to. That's who I hope is still in that office, he said. That's the man who's had 8 years to either get harder and angrier about land fraud or get comfortable and quiet about it, she said. Either way works for us, Caleb. Angry and experienced is what we need. Comfortable and quiet is what the ledger fixes. He looked at her. That quiet reassessment again. How do you do that, he said. Do what? Find the version of a thing that still works. She thought about it honestly. I spent a long time teaching children who had been told they weren't smart, she said. You learn to look for the angle that opens the door instead of the angle that proves it's locked. He nodded slowly, said nothing. But the set of his shoulders changed slightly, and she understood that was what passed for relief in the language of Caleb Rourke. They slept on opposite sides of the fire with their bedrolls and their rifles, and a correct and careful distance between them, which was the right thing, and they both knew it, and it cost them both something anyway. The second day of riding brought them down out of the high mountain and into the broader valley trail that led toward Denver, and it also brought them their first real trouble since leaving the ranch. They were 2 hours out from the valley floor when Caleb pulled up suddenly and Grace pulled up beside him. "Rider behind us," he said low. "Quarter mile. Same pace as ours." She didn't turn. "Since when?" "Since the switchback. Maybe longer." He kept his voice level. "Single horse, not pushing, just matching. Crowder's man. Maybe. Or someone he telegraphed ahead." He thought for a moment. "There's a fork in the trail half a mile ahead. Right branch goes to the Valley Road, obvious route to Denver. Left branch is a sheep trail that adds 4 hours but comes out north of the city near the stockyards." "If it's one of Crowder's men, he knows the Valley Road," Grace said. "If it's one of Crowder's men, he already telegraphed someone waiting on the Valley Road," Caleb said. "One man following is the distraction. The real problem is what he's guiding us toward." She thought fast. "Left branch. Adds 4 hours. Better than whatever's waiting on the Valley Road." He nodded once. "When I say go, we go fast. Don't look back." "All right. Go." They pushed the horses hard and took the left fork. And the sheep trail was exactly what Caleb had said. Rough, overgrown, slow going in places, and when they finally stopped to let the horses breathe, an hour later, there was no one behind them. The follower had either stayed on the Valley Road, not seen the turn, or decided the sheep trail wasn't worth the trouble. All three options made Grace's jaw ache from clenching it. "Someone telegraphed ahead," she said. "Yes. Crowder knows we're coming." "He knew we'd have to come eventually," Caleb said. "Denver's the only play." "Then he's got someone waiting at the commissioner's office." "Maybe." He looked at the trail ahead. "Or he's got someone waiting at every logical entry point, and he's covering his bets." He looked at her. "Walt's list." She already had the folded paper in her hand. She read through the names, 3 names. 2 addresses in the city's north quarter, 1 near the stockyards. "This one," she said, pointing. "Robert Aldine. Walt's note says, 'Honest man has a horse and doesn't ask questions.' That's the stockyard address." "We go to Aldine first," Caleb said. "Get the horses off the street. Then we figure out how to get to Marsh without walking through a front door that's being watched." It was a good plan. It was the best plan available. What neither of them knew was that Robert Aldine was going to turn out to be the second biggest surprise of the entire journey. Aldine was a broad-shouldered man of about 60, silver-haired with the specific kind of stillness that came from decades of working around large animals. He opened his stockyard gate, looked at the 2 dusty, trail-worn people on horseback in front of him, looked at Caleb and said, "You Walt's man." "Walt's friend," Caleb said. "Caleb Rourke. This is Grace Whitaker." Aldine looked at Grace for a long moment. Something moved in his expression. "Whitaker?" he said slowly. "From Millhaven." Her spine went straight. "Yes." "You're the school teacher they said stole the church money." "That's what Crowder's trial decided," she said. Aldine stared at her for another second. Then he opened the gate wider. "Get those horses in. Get yourselves inside." He looked up and down the road before he closed the gate. "I've been waiting 3 days for someone to show up with that ledger." Grace and Caleb both went very still. "How do you know about the ledger?" Caleb said. "Because Daniel Marsh has been in my kitchen for 2 days," Aldine said, already walking toward the house, "and he is extremely impatient." Daniel Marsh was younger looking than Grace had imagined from Caleb's description. Or maybe it was the opposite. He looked like a man who had spent years in a fight that aged him past his years, and then refusing to admit it had somehow balanced out. Sharp eyes, ink-stained fingers, a stack of papers on Aldine's kitchen table that she recognized immediately as territorial land filings. He stood up when they walked in. He looked at Caleb for 1 second. "Rourke," he said. "About time." "Marsh." Something moved in Caleb's face, the particular thing that happened when a man found that the version of someone he'd held in memory for 10 years was still mostly intact. "You got the wire." "I got the wire and the page copies, and I spent the next 18 hours pulling every filing in the territorial records under the names you sent me." Marsh looked at Grace. "And you must be the woman who walked out of Millhaven with the proof." "I'm the woman who was thrown out," Grace said. "There's a difference." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, not quite respect, something that encompassed both and landed firmer than either. "Yes," he said, "I imagine there is." He gestured at the table. "Sit down. We have a great deal to go through, and very little time to go through it." Grace sat. She reached into her sleeve and laid the ledger flat on the table in front of him. Marsh looked at it. He didn't touch it immediately. He looked at it the way a man looked at something he'd been told existed, but hadn't fully believed in until this moment. Then he opened it to the first page. And his expression changed into something that was the most professionally terrifying thing Grace had seen in all of this, the expression of a man who had suspected the scope of something for years, and was now seeing the proof of it exceed even that suspicion. "My God," he said quietly. He turned a page, then another. "This isn't just Crowder." "No," Grace said. "The assessor's office. 3 county commissioners." He stopped. He looked up at her. "The circuit judge." "Page 47, she said. He turned to page 47. He read it. He read it again. Then he looked at Caleb. Then back at Grace. He closed the ledger very carefully, the way you closed something that had just become the most important object in a room. "This isn't a land fraud case," he said. "No," Grace said. "It's a criminal conspiracy against the territorial government. It has been for at least 4 years." Marsh sat back. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside stockyard sounds drifted through animals workers, the ordinary world going about its business completely unaware of what was sitting on a kitchen table in a stockman's house in Denver. "Crowder has someone watching my office," Marsh said. "I've known it for 2 days, which is why I'm here instead of there." "We were followed on the trail," Caleb said. "Left branch." "Smart." Marsh looked at them both with the assessing expression of a man reorganizing his entire plan in real time. "We can't go through the commissioner's office. Not directly. If Crowder knows I have the wire, he'll have people at every official entry point." He paused. "But the territorial governor's office is a different matter." Grace looked at him. "You have access to the governor. I have a meeting with him tomorrow morning at 9 that I scheduled 3 days ago for completely unrelated budget reasons." Marsh looked at the ledger. "Budget meetings are boring. Nobody watches budget meetings." He looked up at them both. "How do you feel about attending a very boring budget meeting?" Caleb looked at Grace. Grace looked at the ledger on the table. "I feel," she said carefully, "like I've been waiting 2 months for a boring meeting." They stayed at Aldine's that night. Real beds, real walls, the unfamiliar softness of a house that wasn't a mountain camp, and Grace lay on her back in the dark and listened to the city sounds outside and felt the strangeness of it pressing in. She heard Caleb moving in the room down the hall. She heard him settle. She heard the house go quiet. She thought about tomorrow. The ledger. Marsh. The governor's office at 9 in the morning. The careful, ordinary walk through a front door that nobody was watching because nobody watched budget meetings. She thought about Crowder waking up tomorrow, not knowing where they were or what was about to happen to everything he'd built. And then underneath all of that, underneath the strategy and the ledger and the families whose names she carried in her sleeve, she thought about a step outside a cabin door and a hand wrapped around hers that hadn't needed to hold on and had held on anyway. She thought about a man who had said, "I don't have anyone waiting on me," and hadn't said it as a complaint. Just as a fact he'd made his peace with. She thought about how different that fact was going to look by the end of tomorrow. She pressed her hand flat against her sleeve. The ledger was there, hard and real and full of names. So was everything else. Grace didn't sleep past 5. She was up before the house stirred, sitting at Aldine's kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her, going through it one final time. Not looking for new information. She knew every page by now, the way you knew a thing you'd carried against your body for weeks. She was reading it the way you read something before you gave it away. The last private look before it became evidence. Before it became a legal instrument, before it stopped being the thing that had kept her alive and became the thing that would settle the account. Caleb came in while she was on the last page. He looked at her at the table and at the ledger, and he didn't say good morning or comment on the hour. He just went to the stove and built up the fire and put the coffee on, and that simple domestic certainty of him, the complete absence of drama about being awake at 5 in the morning in a stranger's kitchen, preparing for the most important day of both their lives, settled something in her chest that had been wound tight all night. "How do you feel?" he said with his back to her. "Like I've been waiting for this day for 2 months," she said. "Scared?" She thought about it honestly. Yes, but the useful kind. He turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at her with that direct, unguarded look that had been getting steadily less rare over the last week. "What's the difference? Scared that stops you is fear," she said. "Scared that sharpens you is just information." She closed the ledger. "I have a lot of information this morning." Something moved in his expression. Quick and warm and gone before it settled into anything nameable. He turned back to the coffee. "Marsh wants to leave by 8, he said. "Governor's office is 20 minutes on foot. We walk separately, you with Marsh, me 2 blocks behind. In case Crowder's people are watching the route, they won't be watching a woman and a government clerk walking to a budget meeting." He poured coffee and brought both cups to the table and sat down across from her. "They'll be watching for me. Because you're the mountain cowboy who's been shooting their riders off his property," she said. "More or less." The corner of his mouth moved. "You're better cover than I am." She picked up her coffee, looked at him over the rim of the cup. "You know what happens after today?" It wasn't a question. He knew she wasn't talking about the legal proceedings. He held her eyes. "I know what I want to happen," he said. Quiet and direct the way he said everything important. No decoration on it. Her heart did something it had been threatening to do for 3 days. She kept her face even. "Tell me." "After," he said. "Let's finish this first." She nodded. She respected that. She also understood that he'd just made a promise with the word after, and Caleb Rourke was not a man who made promises he didn't intend to keep. They drank their coffee in the early morning quiet, and neither of them needed to fill the silence with anything more. Marsh came downstairs at 7:30 with his papers in a leather satchel and the specific focused calm of a man who had rehearsed the next 2 hours enough times in his head that he'd burned off most of the fear and was running on competence now. He looked at Grace and Caleb at the table, and he said, "You both sleep?" "Some," Grace said. "Good enough," he said. He sat down and spread 3 papers on the table. "Here's how this works. The governor's name is James Whitfield. He has been in office 4 years, and he is, as far as I can determine, genuinely clean, which in this territory is either a miracle or a liability depending on how you look at it." He looked at Grace. "He's going to ask you to speak first. When he does, don't give him the background. Don't give him the history. Give him page 47. "The judge," she said. "A corrupt circuit judge is a threat to his authority, his appointments, and his legacy," Marsh said. "That's the entry point. Everything else follows from there." He looked at Caleb. "And you." "I'm the corroborating property owner," Caleb said. "Documented target of the same fraud. Current resident of record on land Crowder has already filed against." Marsh pointed at him. "Exactly that. Exactly those words." He gathered the papers back into the satchel. "The governor has 2 aides in that meeting. One of them I know and trust. The other one I know and do not trust. The one I don't trust has a habit of leaving meetings early to make telegraph calls. If he leaves, we move faster," Grace said. Marsh looked at her. "You've done this before. I've taught rooms full of people who didn't want to be there," she said. "Same principle. You find who's paying attention and you give them something worth paying attention to before you lose the room." Marsh almost smiled. "Right," he said. "Let's go." The walk to the governor's office was 22 minutes, and Grace counted every one of them. She walked beside Marsh at a pace that was purposeful without being urgent. The ledger in her sleeve, her spine straight, her face carrying the specific expression she had practiced in every difficult room she'd ever walked into. Not defiant, not afraid, simply present. The expression of a woman who belonged exactly where she was standing. 2 blocks behind her, she could feel Caleb's presence without seeing it. She couldn't explain that rationally. She just knew he was there the way you knew certain things about people after you'd spent enough concentrated time surviving alongside them. The governor's building had 2 men at the front entrance. Marsh greeted them by name and signed the visitor log, and Grace signed beside him as his assistant, a description that made something wry move through her, and something fierce right behind it, and they went up a wide staircase to the 2nd floor. The aide Marsh trusted met them in the hall outside the office. Young, competent-looking, with the expression of a man who had been briefed on something serious and was managing not to show it. "He's ready," the aide said quietly. "Pemberton is already in there." A slight pause on the name. The one Marsh didn't trust. Marsh looked at Grace. She looked back at him. The communication was instantaneous and wordless. Move, fast, move, clean. Don't give Pemberton time to process what he's hearing before the governor does. "Thank you, Thomas," Marsh said. They went in. Governor Whitfield was a compact man in his 50s with a gray beard trimmed close, and the attentive eyes of someone who had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing in any meeting was what wasn't being said. He looked up from his desk when they came in, and he looked at Marsh, and then he looked at Grace, and he waited. Pemberton was at the side table already making notes on something. Early 40s, soft around the jaw with the particular quality of alertness that wasn't curiosity, it was surveillance. Marsh introduced himself, referred to the budget context briefly enough to be technically accurate, and then said, "Governor, I need to set aside the budget matter. There's something more urgent." Whitfield looked at him for a moment. "How urgent?" "There is a criminal conspiracy operating in this territory that has stolen land from 53 families over 4 years, Marsh said. "It involves a county assessor, 3 county commissioners, and a sitting circuit judge." He paused. "I have a witness and documentary evidence." The room was very still. Whitfield looked at Grace. "You're the witness." "Yes, sir," Grace said. "My name is Grace Whitaker. I was a school teacher in Millhaven. I was convicted of theft 2 months ago on fabricated evidence created by a land broker named Silas Crowder after I refused his marriage proposal and discovered what he had been doing to mountain ranching families." She reached into her sleeve and drew out the ledger and laid it on the governor's desk. "This is Crowder's private accounting of every fraudulent transaction," she said. "It is in his own hand. Page 47 documents 3 payments to Circuit Judge Harold Crane, totaling $400 over 2 years. Pemberton stood up from the side table. Whitfield held up one hand without looking away from Grace, and Pemberton sat back down. It was the gesture of a man who knew exactly what that movement meant and was not going to allow it. Whitfield opened the ledger to page 47. He read it. He read it slowly and completely the way a man read something when he understood that every word was going to matter. Then he turned back to the first page and started reading from the beginning. The room stayed silent for 11 minutes. Grace counted. She stood still, and she breathed, and she let the ledger speak for itself, the way she had always intended it to, the way she had carried it for 2 months, knowing this exact moment was what it was for. Pemberton made a small movement at the 14-minute mark. A slight shifting of weight, a hand toward his coat pocket. "Mr. Pemberton," Whitfield said without looking up from the ledger, "sit still." Pemberton sat still. At the 18-minute mark, Whitfield closed the ledger. He looked at Grace. "How long have you had this?" he said. "Physically 2 months," she said. the knowledge of what was happening to those families longer. You were convicted on false evidence. Yes, sir. And you carried this ledger out of Millhaven after your conviction. I carried it in before my conviction, she said. I took it from Crowder's office when I had confirmed what it contained. I kept it through the trial, through the sentencing, through being put out of a wagon on a mountain trail, and left to die. She held his eyes. I kept it because 53 families lost their land, and most of them don't know why, and a judge in this territory has been taking money from the man responsible for it. Whitfield looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Pemberton. Leave the room, he said. Governor, I think... That wasn't a suggestion. Pemberton left. The door closed behind him, and Marsh immediately crossed to it and locked it, and stood against it with the expression of a man who had about 4 minutes before the telegraph machine in the building downstairs started sending messages. We need to move quickly, Marsh said. Yes, we do, Whitfield said. He was already standing, already moving to the cabinet behind his desk. He took out 2 blank warrant forms and laid them on the desk and picked up his pen. Mr. Marsh, I need the assessor's full name and office address. Miss Whitaker, I need you to sit down and start from the beginning and tell me every family name in that ledger that you can recall from memory while I read the rest of it. He looked up at them both. Thomas, he called. The door to the inner office opened, and the aide appeared immediately. Sir? Get me Judge Alderman from the Federal Circuit. Tell him it's the governor, and it cannot wait. Yes, sir. And Thomas, use the back stairs. What happened in the next 4 hours was the kind of organized chaos that Grace had only ever read about in newspaper accounts of other people's crises. She sat across from the territorial governor of Colorado, and she named names and dates and figures from memory while Marsh cross-referenced against the ledger, and Whitfield filled out paperwork with the focused speed of a man who had decided on action, and was not going to allow himself to slow down and think about the implications until the action was complete. Federal Judge Alderman arrived within 40 minutes. A tall, spare man with cold eyes and a very quiet fury about what he was shown that Grace found enormously reassuring. The arrest warrant for Silas Crowder was signed at 11:14 in the morning. The warrant for Circuit Judge Harold Crane followed at 11:22. The assessor's warrant at 11:30. Grace sat in her chair and watched them being signed, and she felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief, not even the satisfaction she'd imagined for 2 months. She felt something quieter and more complete than any of those things. The feeling of a weight being transferred from her body to the place where it had always belonged. The feeling of justice taking on its own gravity at last. Marsh crossed to her and put a hand briefly on her shoulder. It's done, he said. She looked at the signed warrants on the governor's desk. Not yet, she said. He looked at her. Crowder has to actually be arrested, she said. Crane has to be suspended. The families have to be notified. She looked at Marsh. The case has to be made in open court with this ledger as evidence, so that every person in this territory who was told I was a thief hears the truth from a judge's bench. Marsh held her gaze. Then he nodded slowly with the respect of a man who had just been corrected on what completion actually looked like. Yes, he said. You're right. Whitfield looked up from his desk. Miss Whitaker, he said, I am issuing a formal stay of your conviction effective immediately pending review. You will receive a written document before you leave this building. He paused. I am also going to personally recommend to the court that your conviction be expunged entirely, not merely reviewed. What was done to you was a perversion of this territory's legal system, and I intend to say so on record. Grace looked at him. She had prepared herself for many versions of this moment, over 2 months of carrying that ledger. She had prepared for resistance and negotiation, and the slow grinding machinery of institutions protecting themselves. She had not prepared for a governor looking her in the eye and using the word perversion and meaning it. She said, "Thank you, sir." And her voice came out steady, which was an achievement she was quietly proud of. Caleb was waiting on the corner 2 blocks from the building. He was leaning against a post with his arms crossed and his hat low, and the studied casual posture of a man who had been waiting for a very long time and was not going to let anyone see how hard the waiting had been. He straightened when he saw her come around the corner with Marsh. He read her face before she said a single word. Something moved through his expression. Something she could only describe as the specific relief of a man who has been holding a door shut against something heavy for a long time and has just been told he can let go. Marsh shook Caleb's hand and said something about follow-up proceedings and the land commissioner's office and testimony scheduling, and Grace heard all of it and filed it away. But she was watching Caleb's face and he was watching hers. And there was a conversation happening entirely above and below the practical words that Marsh was saying. When Marsh finished and excused himself with the tact of a man who understood very clearly what he was excusing himself from, they were left standing on a Denver street corner in the full summer noon heat, two dusty trail-worn people with two horses at a stockyard nearby and a mountain ranch 4 days back the way they'd come. "Warrants signed," she said. "All of them. Crowder the judge, the assessor." She paused. "And my conviction is stayed, pending expungement." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away, jaw working, and she realized that what she was seeing in him was not just relief. It was something rawer than that. The particular feeling of a man who had been angry on someone's behalf for 2 weeks and was now being asked to put that anger down because its purpose was finished. "Good," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "Caleb." He looked back at her. "You said after," she said. The two words landed in the space between them, and neither of them moved for a moment, the whole busy street going on around them. Horses' voices, the ordinary noise of a city at noon, and none of it touching the specific quality of stillness inside the circle of what those two words meant. "I did," he said. "It's after." He looked at her with those dark eyes that had been calculating the cost of things since the first moment she'd seen him on a mountain road, and she watched him finish the calculation. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "This specific thing. I've been alone long enough that I've forgotten most of the vocabulary for it." "I know," she said. "I've been alone too. I'm not a comfortable man to be around. I've noticed. I work long hours in rough conditions, and I don't talk much, and I live 4 days from the nearest city. I'm aware. And He stopped. "Caleb," she said. "I walked off a wagon in the middle of a mountain in 100-degree heat with my hands tied and nothing but a ledger sewn in my sleeve, and I made it to a governor's office, and I made it count." She looked at him steadily. "I think I can manage the conditions." Something broke open in his expression then, not dramatically. Caleb Rourke was not a dramatic man. It was quiet and genuine, and it changed his whole face in the way that the smallest shifts sometimes changed everything, the way dawn didn't arrive all at once, but the world was suddenly different anyway. He reached out and took her hand. Not the wounded one, not the bandaged one. Just her hand, standing on a Denver street corner in the noon heat, holding on the way he had in Aldine's kitchen, when she hadn't been sure it was a decision or an accident. It was a decision. She understood that now. "All right," he said. That was all. "All right." 2 words with the whole weight of what he meant inside them, offered plain and direct, without decoration, the way he offered everything. She held on. "All right," she said back. "Oh." Crowder was arrested in Millhaven 3 days later. Grace wasn't there for it. She heard about it from Marsh, who sent a wire to Aldine's address before they left Denver. Brief professional containing the specific words, "Territorial marshals took Crowder into custody without incident at his office at 2 in the afternoon, which Grace read twice, and then folded very carefully and put in her pocket next to the ledger. Circuit Judge Crane was suspended the same day, pending federal investigation. The county assessor resigned before the marshals reached his office, which Marsh said in a follow-up wire was either cowardice or intelligence, and probably both. The territorial court issued a formal notice of expungement on Grace's conviction 6 days after their meeting with Whitfield. It came by post to Aldine's address, a single page with the official seal, her name, and the words "conviction vacated" in full record, Expunged reputation, restored by order of the Territorial Court of Colorado. She read it standing in Aldine's hallway, and Caleb was right behind her, and she heard him read it over her shoulder, and she heard the breath. He let out slow and controlled, and she turned around, and he was close enough that she had to look up to see his face. "It's real," she said. "It's real," he confirmed. She folded the document and put it in her other pocket, opposite the ledger. Two things she had carried to very different ends. They rode back to the mountain on the main valley road, no sheep trail, no watching their backs every quarter mile. 4 days in open country with the summer moving toward its late August gold, and the light going long and clean in the afternoons, and the two of them talking more than they had in all the days before combined. She learned that he had been engaged once 10 years ago to a woman in Kentucky who had eventually decided that a man who wanted to go west and build something from nothing was not the man she wanted to build her life beside. He said it without bitterness, just fact. He learned that she had come west because Missouri had started to feel like a room she'd already understood entirely, and she had always suspected there were rooms she hadn't seen yet. He listened to this with the expression of a man who recognized something. "That's the bravest reason I've ever heard for moving west," he said. "Most people thought it was foolish," she said. "Most people," he said, "build small fences around things they don't understand and call it wisdom." She looked at him. He was looking at the trail ahead with that steady profile she had memorized somewhere in the second week without meaning to. "You could have gone smaller yourself," she said. "After 10 years alone up there, you could have built a smaller life, tighter, safer." "I could have," he said. "Why didn't you?" He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything. "Because smaller didn't feel like surviving," he said. "It felt like a slower way of disappearing." She understood that with every fiber of what she was. She didn't say so. She just rode beside him in the long afternoon light and felt it land. Walt was at the gate when they came through. He looked at them both and looked at the way they were riding close enough that their horses' shoulders nearly touched easy and unguarded, and he said nothing whatsoever, which was the most eloquent possible response. Pete came out of the barn and immediately asked if Crowder was actually arrested, and when Caleb said yes, Pete let out a sound that was somewhere between a shout and a laugh, and then composed himself with the dignity of a young man who remembered at the last moment that he was trying to seem older than 19. Walt shook Caleb's hand. Then he looked at Grace. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she said. He shook his head slightly, not disagreeing, just acknowledging something he didn't have language for and had decided not to need language for. He turned and walked back toward the corral, and Grace understood that was Walt's version of a standing ovation. The letters Marsh sent over the next 3 weeks came steadily, each one carrying news that Grace read aloud at the supper table while Pete listened and Walt pretended not to listen from across the room. The Briggs family's land claim was under formal review. Henderson had been located in Wyoming and notified of the proceedings. 11 of the 53 families had already come forward with documentation to support their claims. The Territorial Court had appointed a special review commissioner, not the bought assessor, not anyone connected to Crowder's network to process restitution filings. It wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. It wasn't the fairy tale version where justice arrived in a single afternoon and everyone went home restored. Real justice was slower and more bureaucratic and occasionally maddening, and required follow-up letters and documentation, and Marsh's extremely patient legal mind working through layers of deliberate obfuscation that Crowder had spent 4 years constructing. But it was happening. It was real. And every letter that came confirmed that the ledger was doing exactly what she had carried it for. The schoolhouse at the north end of the valley had been closed for 2 years. The ranching families in the upper mountain had no school for their children, no place for the hired hands who'd been cheated out of contracts they couldn't read, no center point for the community that Crowder's systematic destruction had scattered. Grace found the building on a Tuesday in early September. She walked through it alone, assessed the roof, workable the floor sound, and the windows, 2 of which needed replacement. She stood in the middle of the empty room and looked at the afternoon light coming through the gaps, and thought about what a room could be when someone decided it was worth something again. She walked back to the ranch and found Caleb in the corral. "The schoolhouse on the North Valley Road," she said. He looked at her. "I know the one. It needs a new roof section on the east side and 2 windows replaced. The rest is sound." He held her eyes for a moment. "You want to reopen it?" "I want to teach again," she said. "Here. For the ranch children and the families coming back, and anyone else who needs to know how to read a contract before they sign one." She paused. "I've been thinking about what these families needed to protect themselves. It wasn't just the ledger. It was the knowledge to read what was being done to them." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "The east roof section will take 2 days," he said. "I've got cedar shingles in the barn from last fall." "I know," she said. "I found them." That moved something in his expression. The quiet amusement and the recognition together. "Of course you did," he said. They started on the roof the following Saturday. Caleb and Pete and Walt and 2 neighboring ranchers who had heard through the Valley Telegraph, which was to say, through Walt, telling one person who told everyone that something was happening at the old schoolhouse and had shown up with tools without being asked. Grace worked alongside them. She handed up shingles and she pulled nails, and she did not stand back and supervise because the schoolhouse was hers to build as much as it was theirs to help with, and she intended to put her own hands on every part of it. By Sunday afternoon, the east roof was done. By the following Wednesday, the windows were replaced. By the end of September, 7 children were sitting on new-made benches, and Grace was standing at the front of the room with a piece of chalk and the same feeling she'd had in every classroom of her life, the specific aliveness of a room where someone was learning something for the first time. Caleb came to get her one evening in early October when the air had turned and the mountain was going gold and copper at the top. She was grading papers, actual papers, the first batch of her students' writing practice, which ranged from extremely promising to enthusiastically illegible, and he appeared in the doorway of the schoolhouse, the way he appeared in most doorways, quiet and filling the frame and not announcing himself. She looked up. "Walk with me," he said. She put down the papers and walked with him. They went out past the corral and along the east fence line, the fence they had mended together in the first week, and the evening was deep blue and cool, and the cattle moved in the far pasture, and the mountain stood up enormous and present behind everything. He stopped at the corner post, the one where she had found the deliberate cut, the first sign that Crowder's people had been working against him, the first moment they had understood they were in the same fight. He looked at the post for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for about 3 weeks," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been watching you figure it out." The corner of his mouth. "Was it obvious?" "Only to me," she said. "Walt probably knows too, but Walt knows everything." He looked at the mountain, then back at her. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not in the way that means I need something from you, and not in the way that means you owe me anything, because you don't. You don't owe me a single thing." He held her eyes. "I want you to stay because this place is better with you in it. Because I am better with you in it. And because I have been alone on this mountain for 10 years, and I did not know until you showed up half dead on a dirt road that I was waiting for someone with enough courage to make the loneliness make sense." The evening was very quiet. Grace looked at him, this rough, solitary, decent man who had handed her a canteen and a rifle and walked beside her through fire and legal warfare and 3 days of hard mountain riding, and had said, "I don't know how to be soft, but I know how to stand," and had proven that second part every single day she'd known him. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Grace, Caleb." She stepped closer. "I reopened a schoolhouse. I have 17 families sending me their children next month. I have correspondence with the territorial court and a ledger that's going to be evidence in 3 separate proceedings." She looked at him with everything she had. "I am not going anywhere. I am already home." He looked at her for a long, still moment. Then he reached out and put his hand against her face, careful and certain. The same hands that mended fences and rode night trails, and wrapped her thumb in a strip of clean cloth at a fence line, and held on in a kitchen in Denver when she needed him to. "All right," he said. His voice was low and rough, and the most honest thing she'd ever heard. She put her hand over his. "All right," she said. The lamp in the cabin window burned that night, visible from the trail, visible from the ridge, visible to anyone coming down from the mountain who needed to know that someone lived here and the door was not locked. Grace had put it there, not as a signal to anyone in particular, just as a fact. A declaration of the plainest kind that this place was inhabited and warm, and that the woman inside it had fought for every right she had to be there and intended to stay. Walt, coming in from the last fence check, saw it from 50 yards out and stopped for a moment and looked at it. Then he nodded once, the way a man nodded at a thing that had finally come out the way it was supposed to. He went inside and had his coffee and said nothing to anyone, which was exactly right. Because some things didn't need commentary. Some things just needed to be true. And this was true. Grace Whitaker had been thrown off a wagon in the dust and the heat and the nothing, and she had stood up, and she had walked, and she had carried the proof of 53 families in her sleeve and delivered it to the people who could use it. And she had not broken once. Not once. She had come through the fire, the literal kind and the other kind. And she had come out standing, not because anyone rescued her, but because she refused to fall in a direction that led away from the fight. And the mountain cowboy who had found her on a dirt road and handed her a canteen without ceremony,